Today, we're looking into a name that almost everyone recognizes, yet the actual person behind it is, well, shrouded in this really fascinating historical puzzle. We're talking about Aesop. The name makes you think of talking animals, and these timeless moral lessons, wisdom passed down through ages. But how much do we really know about the man himself?
It's quite something, isn't it? You've almost certainly come across Aesop's fables, maybe as a child, or perhaps quoted somewhere today. But despite this huge cultural footprint, the historical Aesop is genuinely one of antiquity's great mysteries. What we often think we know is really this rich, tangled mix of possible facts, legends, and how people have seen him differently over time.
Exactly. So our aim here is to try and unpack some of the surprising complexities behind this legendary storyteller. We'll look at the few historical clues we have, the really dramatic, almost novelistic biographies that came later, and trace how his image has changed.
From ancient Greece right up to how we see him now.
You'll find that a lot of what we assume about Aesop is this captivating blend, part reality, maybe part fiction, and a whole lot of cultural reshaping.
We'll try to untangle this strange situation. A name everyone knows, tied to someone whose very existence is debated. We'll follow the incredible path his fables took across centuries and get into the really interesting arguments about what he looks like, where he came from.
It's a story that ultimately tells us as much about storytelling itself, its power, as it does about the man, or perhaps the myth behind it all.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start with this elusive figure then. Who was Aesop? We generally know him as a Greek fabulist, the storyteller credited with the collection we just call Aesop's Fables.
Right, the standard definition.
But here's the central puzzle right off the bat. Even though he's as widely recognized as almost anyone from the Greco-Roman world, it's actually far from certain that a single historical Aesop ever really lived.
That really is the core of it. It's quite astonishing. Really, no writings by him survive. Not a single verified word. Instead, countless stories attributed to him were gathered over centuries, translated into numerous languages, creating this storytelling tradition that's still alive today. And these tales, as you know, often feature those very distinctive talking animals, the anthropomorphic characters.
And the time frame we usually associate with him.
Generally placed around 620 to 564 BCE, but again, that's a sort of traditional dating based on later accounts.
It's this massively influential name, but a person who's historically very hazy. What concrete fragments, then, do we actually have from those early historical sources?
Well, some of the earliest Greek writers, think Aristotle, Herodotus, they mention him. They suggest he was born around 620 BCE, perhaps in Mesembria, which was a Greek colony.
Okay.
But then later writers muddy the waters a bit. Some place his birth in Phrygia, over in Anatolia. Others call him Aesop of Sardis, or even the Sage of Lydia. So not even agreement on where he might have come from.
What about his life story? Any consistent threads there?
One thing that pops up fairly often in early accounts is his status as a slave, specifically on the island of Samos.
We even get names for his supposed masters. A philosopher named Xanthus, and then another man, Iadmon. The thinking goes that he must have eventually been freed because later he's mentioned acting as an advocate, sort of like a lawyer, for a wealthy Samian.
From slave to advocate, that's quite a journey.
If true, absolutely. And then perhaps the most famous story about his life, or rather his death, comes from Plutarch, the account of his dramatic end in Delphi. Plutarch claims Aesop was in Delphi on some kind of diplomatic mission for King Croesus of Lydia. Apparently, he managed to deeply insult the people of Delphi.
Ow.
The details vary, but the outcome was supposedly that they cooked up a fake charge against him, temple theft, a very serious accusation.
And the punishment.
He was condemned and thrown from a cliff, a brutal end, and the legend has a kicker. Supposedly, a plague and famine then struck Delphi as divine punishment for executing him unjustly.
Wow. So already we're deep into legendary territory there. And interestingly, he was also sometimes linked to the famous seven sages of Greece. There are stories of him dining with them, sitting beside the great lawmaker Solon. He was apparently a popular contender for inclusion in that very elite list.
Which brings us squarely to this challenge for historians: separating the potential person from the powerful legend.
Precisely. It's a constant struggle. There was a very influential scholar on Aesop, Ben Edwin Perry, writing in the mid-20th century, concluded that basically everything connecting Aesop to famous figures like King Croesus or any of the seven wise men had to be seen as, well, literary fiction, creative storytelling, not history.
So he dismissed those high-profile connections.
He did. And he also dismissed the dramatic Delphi death story as pure legend, mainly arguing it didn't fit chronologically with other known events.
Okay, so a big chunk of what feels like historical detail might just be later invention.
Hmm.
That really changes how you think about them, doesn't it? It highlights how legends get built, layer upon layer.
It absolutely does. It shows how historical figures can become focal points for storytelling, absorbing anecdotes and connections that might not have any basis, in fact. The story becomes more important than the historical reality.
But is that the final word? Has later research offered any different perspectives?
Well, yes, it's become a bit more nuanced. Some later research suggests that actually a diplomatic mission for Croesus and perhaps a visit to another ruler, Periander, could potentially be consistent with the time frame around Aesop's presumed death.
Ah, so maybe not entirely fictional.
Possibly not entirely, but then you still run into definite chronological problems in other stories. For example, the Roman writer Phaedrus places Aesop in Athens during the time of the tyrant Pisistratos,
Okay.
and he has Aesop telling the fable about the frogs asking for a king. The problem is Pisistratos' reign was decades after the traditional date given for Aesop's death.
So clear anachronisms there.
Definitely. Historians are constantly navigating this, trying to sift potential kernels of truth from what is clearly embellishment or later legendary accretion. It's like detective work, with very few, often contradictory clues.
That blurred line, as you called it, between history and legend seems perfectly embodied in the Aesop romance. You mentioned it earlier. This work sounds crucial for understanding the popular image of Aesop.
Oh, it's absolutely pivotal. The Aesop romance isn't history. It's an anonymous work of Greek popular literature, probably composed around the 2nd century CE. Think of it like an ancient bestseller, a folk book, meaning it wasn't a fixed text by a single author. It was a story that people clearly loved, and different writers or storytellers likely adapted it, added bits, changed things to suit their own purposes over time. It's a fascinating piece of popular fiction from the ancient world.
And it gives us a very specific and quite memorable picture of Aesop.
Unforgettable, really. This romance describes him as a slave, originally from Phrygia on Samos, and crucially, it portrays him as, well, extremely ugly, even initially unable to speak.
Mute at first. How does he gain his voice?
There's a magical element. The story goes that he shows kindness to a traveling priestess of the goddess Isis. As a reward, the goddess herself grants him not only the power of speech, but also this incredible talent for clever storytelling and riddle solving.
And he uses this newfound gift.
Oh, does he ever? The romance is full of episodes where he uses his wit sometimes to help his master, the philosopher Xanthus, but often to completely confound him, embarrassing him in front of his students. There's even a part where he sleeps with Xanthus's wife.
Really, so it's quite scandalous in parts.
It's very much a popular entertainment full of wit, trickery, and reversals of fortune. The story follows his journey. He eventually wins his freedom after interpreting some kind of omen or portent that no one else can figure out. Then he acts as an emissary, traveling to the courts of various, often imaginary rulers like Lycurgus of Babylon, and finally it all leads to that fateful trip to Delphi.
The same ending as the Plutarch story.
Essentially, yes, but fleshed out in this fictional narrative. He angers the Delphians, this time specifically by telling insulting fables, gets sentenced to death on a trumped-up charge, and is forced to jump from the cliff. It provides a complete, dramatic, and highly influential life story for this figure.
So if the Aesop romance gave us this incredibly popular, though fictional story of Aesop the master storyteller, it brings us back to a fundamental question. Did this legendary figure, or even a possible historical one, actually write the fables we associate with him?
Or perhaps the ancient equivalent. The Aesop romance certainly claims he wrote them down, and Herodotus, centuries earlier, did call him a writer of fables.
Writer could mean different things.
Exactly. It might simply mean he was known as a teller of fables, a performer, or it could mean that a collection of popular, perhaps already existing, fables was simply ascribed to him, gathered under his famous name. We don't have proof he personally authored them in the modern sense.
But classical authors definitely connected him with specific fables.
Oh, certainly. The playwright Sophocles, for instance, referenced the fable of the North Wind and the Sun in one of his plays, clearly associating it with Aesop. And famously, Socrates, while he was in prison awaiting execution, supposedly spent time turning some of Aesop's fables into verse.
So even if he didn't write them all down himself, the association was strong very early on.
Extremely strong, which tells you how prominent his reputation as a fabulist was, even in classical Athens.
And these fables themselves, they weren't just static stories passed down unchanged, were they?
Not at all. Their transmission history is just as fascinating as Aesop's own story. There was apparently an early collection by Demetrius of Phalerum around 300 BCE, but that's lost. What we have are later versions. Well, Phaedrus rendered many of them into Latin verse in the 1st century CE. Babrius did something similar in Greek, using a specific poetic meter a bit later. Avianus compiled 42 fables into Latin elegiac couplets around 400 CE.
So they were constantly being retold and reshaped for different audiences and literary tastes.
Absolutely. And this continued through the Middle Ages and beyond. Fables were revised, translated, and crucially, new material from other cultures often got added into the mix. So the body of stories we call Aesop's fables today is really a composite collection bearing maybe only a distant relation to whatever tales might have been told by a historical Aesop, if he existed.
It really underscores how stories live and breathe, adapting across time and cultures. And speaking of adaptation, Aesop's physical appearance and even his origins had gone through quite a transformation too. You mentioned the Aesop romance describes him as extremely ugly.
It does, and it's not just a passing comment. It gives this incredibly vivid, almost grotesque description. Let me see if I can recall some of it. Of loathsome aspect. Pot-bellied, misshapen of head, snub-nosed, swarthy, dwarfish, bandy-legged, short-armed, squint-eyed, liver-lipped, a portentous monstrosity.
Wow, that is incredibly detailed and negative.
It really is. And this image, whether it had any basis in reality or was purely a literary device, perhaps to contrast his inner wisdom with his outer appearance, it definitely took hold in the popular imagination for a very long time.
Do we see this reflected in early art as well?
We do. There was a famous Greek red figure cup dating to around 450 BCE, so quite early. It shows a man interacting with a fox, a classic Aesopic scene, and the description of the man is striking. Emaciated body and oversized head, ugly, with long hair, bald head, and unkempt, scraggly beard. He seems to be listening intently to the fox.
So this idea of a physically unusual, perhaps even deformed storyteller was linked to Aesop quite early on and persisted for centuries.
It seems so. But what's really fascinating is how another, quite different tradition emerged much later regarding his appearance and origin.
How so?
This is the tradition depicting Aesop not just as maybe swarthy, but specifically as a black African from Ethiopia, as Ethiopia was known then.
An African Aesop. When did that idea start?
It seems to have first appeared relatively late, with a Byzantine scholar named Maximus Planudes in the 13th century. He compiled a biography of Aesop and included this description.
And was there any basis for it?
Well, Planudes apparently derived the name Aesop from Ethiopian. However, modern linguistic analysis shows this is etymologically incorrect. Scholars generally consider his reasoning on this point pretty much worthless in terms of proving an Ethiopian origin.
So linguistically shaky ground. But the idea didn't just disappear.
Not at all. It resurfaced surprisingly often. For instance, in the 18th century, there's a known Chelsea porcelain figurine explicitly labeled as a Negro Aesop. And in the 19th century, an English scholar named William Martin Leake saw some ancient coins from Delphi that had a head depicted on them, which he speculated might be Aesop, describing it as potentially a head of a Negro, though others strongly disputed his interpretation of those coins.
Right.
Then you have things like an 1876 painting by Roberto Fontana, which clearly portrayed Aesop as black. A French critic reviewing it at the time actually questioned it, asking something like, why is this Aesop black as an Ethiopian? It shows the idea was circulating, but perhaps still surprising to some.
Is there any other evidence people point to? Sometimes you hear about the animals in the fables.
That does come up. The presence of animals like camels, elephants, maybe monkeys or apes associated with Africa.
But does that hold up?
It's circumstantial at best. Firstly, those African elements are arguably more likely to have come into the Greek world via contact with Egypt and Libya, rather than sub-Saharan Ethiopia specifically. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, fables featuring those animals might easily have entered the collection long after any historical Aesop lived, as the body of fables grew and absorbed tales from various sources.
I see. So it's not strong proof of his personal origin.
Not really, yet the idea has persisted. As recently as 2002, a scholar, Richard Laban Jr., argued specifically for Aesop being a Nubian folkteller from the region south of Egypt.
Why do you think this particular image resonated so much, despite the lack of clear evidence?
That's a great question. Part of it seems tied to this powerful perception of Aesop as a culture hero of the oppressed. His traditional status as a slave, combined with his cleverness and ability to speak truth to power through his stories, makes him a compelling figure.
And the connection to African heritage adds another layer.
Exactly. Some have drawn direct parallels with, for example, the stories of the trickster figure Brer Rabbit, which were told by African slaves in North America. The idea that, as one writer put it, for both were slaves and both were black, created this potent image of Aesop as a symbol of resilience, wit, and survival against oppression. It transformed him into something more than just a storyteller.
That really shows how a figure can take on symbolic meaning far beyond the historical details, and this constant evolution of his image carried on into more modern times, too, across different media.
It absolutely did. It's fascinating to track. You have, say, Francis Barlow's famous engravings from 1687, which very clearly depict Aesop as a dwarfish hunchback leaning into that Aesop romance tradition.
Right.
But then contrast that with Diego Velázquez's striking portrait from around 1639-40. His Aesop is arguably not conventionally handsome. He looks thoughtful, perhaps weary, but there are no obvious physical deformities. It's a more realistic human portrayal.
Even architecture got involved.
Yes. In the elaborate gardens of Versailles, created for Louis XIV, there was a famous labyrinth featuring fountains depicting Aesop's fables. And right at the entrance stood a statue of Aesop himself, portrayed as a hunchback.
So the image continued to vary widely. What about the 20th and 21st centuries?
The trend seems to have moved away from the ugly slave trope. Plays often depicted him as a slave, acknowledging that part of the tradition, but generally not as physically deformed or ugly.
And movies and TV.
They've tended to go even further, often portraying him as neither ugly nor a slave. Think of Bill Cosby playing a rather urbane Aesop in a 1971 American TV production.
Okay.
Or, more recently, a 2010 South African musical adaptation which deliberately portrayed Aesop as black and set his story in a context resonant with recent South African history, tying back into that hero of the oppressed theme.
You mentioned acculturation earlier, Aesop plopping up in unexpected places.
Yes, that Japanese example from the 17th century is wonderful. Portuguese missionaries brought the fables to Japan. They were then adapted, translated into Japanese script, and printed locally. And the illustrations depicted Aesop dressed in traditional Japanese clothing.
Amazing. Fully adopted and adapted into a completely different cultural context.
It perfectly illustrates how these stories, and the figure associated with them, can travel and transform, taking on new life and meaning wherever they land.
What an incredible journey we've traced through centuries of storytelling, legend making, and cultural shifts. As we sort of reflect on all this, it's strikingly clear, isn't it? The historical Aesop, the actual person, remains incredibly elusive, almost a ghost.
Very much so, a shadow behind the name.
Yet his fables and the legend of him have had this unbelievably enduring life. They've traveled across continents, languages, centuries, constantly being adapted, reinterpreted, and transformed with each new telling.
His story really is a powerful testament to how narrative works, how figures can become so much larger than any verifiable historical life, reflecting the values, the anxieties, the imagination of generation after generation.
It certainly makes you pause and think, doesn't it? How much of what we believe about many legendary figures from the past is less about solid, provable fact and more about the stories we collectively choose to tell and retell about them?
Absolutely. And those stories, as we've definitely seen with Aesop, often reveal just as much about us, the tellers and the listeners, our own cultures, our own needs, as they do about the supposed subject of the story.
So perhaps the next time you encounter one of those timeless fables or hear the name Aesop, it's worth considering. What other celebrated figures from history might we be viewing through a similar complex lens, a blend of dimly remembered facts, powerful imagination, and the enduring stories we continue to weave?